Hi, Hive. Hillary here, back again with week 2 of the Hive's live Good Book Club, walking through the Gospel of John. If you are reading along with the Good Book Club from Forward Movement, if you're reading along with the Gospel of John, you should be in about chapter 4, starting chapter 4 today. So let's hope you're here on week 2. It's a great, wonderful endeavor, and you're joining with a lot of people doing that. So if you're walking through that, join in here. Let us know how it's going for you. Today I thought I'd give us, as last week, a little bit of a history, a little bit of a teaching, and then a little bit of a thoughtful meditation. Today, as you heard, we're going through some of the 7 I am statements of John. In the last video, we did the 7 signs and the 7 titles, so go back and check that out if you're interested. Here's a little bit of history about the Gospel of John. We think it was written probably around 80 to 100, and the authorship is a big question mark. Some people have even said that traditionally it was possibly written by the disciple of John himself. Some people have lumped it together with the John who wrote Revelation, John of Patmos. However, most scholars agree that it was probably a group of people, the John community, that was associated with the teachings of who the disciple of John might have been, one of the followers of Jesus in Jesus' lifetime. The reason they think that, and they would also then attribute those 3 pastoral letters of John as well, they'd attribute those to the same group. The reason they think that is there's this mysterious character in the Gospel of John called the beloved disciple, or the one who Jesus loved. This is a character who some just say is John, since it's named after him. And yet other people have taken it as an invitation to see it as a larger group, perhaps a community, the disciples that Jesus loved. In particular, Celtic Christians would see this figure and they would describe it as the way we should be seeing ourselves in the gospel. So you can put yourself in the story by way of the beloved disciple. One of the scenes that we'll talk about later on has the classic Last Supper scene. And in John's gospel, the beloved disciple is right next to Jesus, almost reclining next to him in the way they would have eaten at table back in the time. And the Celts used to say, you should be like the beloved disciple, so close to Jesus at that moment that you can hear the heartbeat of God. I think that's beautiful. I love the invitation to hear ourselves in the story by way of this community. And so perhaps when you're reading through the Gospel of John and you hear this character, the beloved disciple, you'll see yourself in the midst of all of that. Okay, it's a little bit of teaching. Today, we're diving into the first I am statement. Jesus made all of these statements as a way of pointing to himself as the bread of life, the way, the truth, all of these things that incorporate who Jesus is. The first one we're going to talk about is I am the bread of life, and I'll read you John 6, chapter 6, verse 35. Then Jesus said, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never be thirsty. Now let me set the scene for you. This is almost immediately after he has been preaching and is doing such a great job. He has attracted a huge crowd. 5,000 people have joined him to hear his message. And they have been there for a while, like outside, listening to him preaching. He liked to preach outside. So long that they needed to eat, but they hadn't brought enough provisions. It had been that long. So Jesus says to his disciples, who say to him, hey, we're in a little bit of a jam here. We don't have enough food for this crowd. Send them away. He says, oh, I'm not going to send anybody away. What I'd like you to do, my followers, please go and see what food we have. So they collected a measly little bit of food, just some bread and a few fish. And as they brought that to him, Jesus thanked God for it, lifted it up, and suddenly they were able to feed the entire crowd with it. And more than that, they were able to bring back baskets full of this bread. Pretty incredible. Following that, they get into a bit of a jam where they're in the disciples go on ahead of Jesus. They are in a storm. Jesus comes to them and calms them down and talks about himself as the bread of life. So what's going on here? Well, let's unpack it. One of the things that Jesus brings up is the fact that the ancestors of the people who are listening to Jesus would have had manna in the wilderness, and yet they still died. What is this mysterious manna? Well, for that we have to go all the way back to the Hebrew Testament, to the time when the Israelites were wandering in the desert after they had been delivered from Egypt, out of bondage, out of slavery, and they are now roaming around the wilderness following God's prophet Moses. At one point, they get tired and scared and very hungry, and they start saying to Moses, "Why have you let us out here? It would have been better to go back to Egypt where at least we had food." I will come back to that because I think it's interesting that sometimes when we are in a hard way, we would prefer perhaps to go back to old habits or old people who have been toxic in our life or old ways rather than actually living in the moment and trying to figure out our next steps. At that point, Moses prays to God, and God sends the people of Israel manna in the wilderness. It's this bread that comes from heaven. It actually almost appears like dew every morning on the flowers and the plants around them. They can pick it. It tastes like honey. It's sustaining, and yet it doesn't sustain them forever. Eventually they will, live a normal life. Like all of us, we will die. Jesus has us fast forward to where he's saying, "I am the bread of life." The very phrase "I am" invokes another story with Moses. When Moses was, before he was the prophet, he was wandering around the wilderness, and a beautiful bush caught on fire. And it's the flame did not consume it. It's considered an incredible wonder and miracle in the Bible. And through this burning bush, God talks to Moses. And Moses says, "Who are you? What's your name?" And he says, "I am who I am." So by saying "I am" over and over again, Jesus is reminding us that he is claiming this name of God, this "I am," and not in some distant way. It's a present moment. It's "I am now." Put all that together. When Jesus says, "I am the bread of life," he is saying that I'm not just going to feed you when you're on a mountaintop and you're hungry and you're listening to a sermon. I'm not just going to feed you once a day when you need it in the wilderness, right? I'm going to feed you in a way that your soul will be fulfilled into eternal life. Those who eat of this bread will never be hungry. Those who drink of this water will never thirst. That goes beyond just here and now into the eternal. Pretty beautiful and amazing stuff. So our question, moving from our teaching into our question, for you, I mean, we know what it is to be hungry, right? We each one of us, thankfully, we're probably not starving, but there are moments when we know hunger. If you're like me, you get a headache, your stomach is rumbling, you might get what we call in my family hangry, which is hungry, angry, and all these things are manifestations of ways that your body needs something. What Jesus is inviting us to ask with this idea of the bread of life is, how will we know when we're spiritually hungry? And what will we feed ourselves with? Some possible ways to know. If you're finding yourself feeling very lonely and cut off from other people, if you are finding yourself being very, very anxious, if you find yourself unable perhaps to even come to prayer, perhaps you're feeling overwhelmed with feelings of shame or whatever. There's lots of things that can indicate our spiritual hunger. I'll tell you just one of mine, and it actually relates to physical hunger. And it's one that actually even Brene Brown talks about, that when she finds herself what she calls dress rehearsing disaster, kind of going over in her mind all the things that could happen. She's afraid, it's sucking her joy away, she's not relying on God. She talks about finding herself in the pantry, wondering how she got through an entire sleeve of Oreos without even realizing she was there. That's a classic one for me. When I find myself kind of grazing and eating and kind of, I've eaten fistfuls of popcorn, I don't even know how I got here. That's a very good indicator for me that perhaps something else is going on, that I might have a spiritual hunger instead. I don't know what your warning signs are, but I do know that if you'd like to share them here at the Hive, we'd love to talk about them. And that there's an invitation here to satiate that spiritual hunger with something other than the things we tend to numb ourselves with, right? You know, too much food, too much TV, too much alcohol, too much drugs, too much of one person, too much of isolation. Instead, ask yourself and ask God what it is you're really hungry for, and how that bread of life might be given to you to sustain you in those wilderness times. All right, my friends, I hope that was a good lesson and meditation for you. Please do comment below. We'd love to hear from you and how this is going for you. All right, God bless.